It's a significant moment when your family marries into a new circle. But becoming part of the House of Windsor is an altogether different matter.
It must be an overwhelming sensation to know that you and your child are going to be forever associated with royalty.
What is it like to suddenly find your family intimately within the royal orbit? Is it a dream?
It was a total shock when it came.
Or a royal nightmare?
And I suppose in love.
Whatever in love means.
Outsiders have struggled to do well when they enter the royal family.
Do you ever have disagreements about things?
Oh, yes.
Tonight, when Fergie met the monarchy, it elevated her family to royalty.
For Ron Ferguson, to have your daughter marry a prince, become a duchess, and to become a senior member of the royal family, I mean, it just doesn't get any better.
But two families coming together brings with it palace politics.
You're not only marrying royal in-laws, but also all of the people working at the palace, and you have to be pretty sophisticated in order to maneuver yourself throughout.
Royal insiders reveal what was said behind closed doors.
Charles apparently said, look, the problem with Sarah is you just can't shut her up.
And when the Fergusons brought scandal to the House of Windsor,
Ronald Ferguson was photographed entering a club for men, and it offered massage. And the rumour got around that the massage wasn't quite all they offered.
we discover what happened to the royals' new relatives.
Senior royals did rue the day that they had ever invited the Ferguson family to join them.
And if there is any way back.
What it meant for Fergie was expulsion from the royal family, and she was on her own again.
The love affair between Fergie and the monarchy began in the summer of 1985 at Ascot. As the royals prepared to return for dinner at Windsor Castle, an unsuspecting Prince Andrew was about to be set up on a date.
Prince Andrew was in the Navy, he was still a bachelor, and I think that the royal family were quite keen for him to settle down. Diana said to the Queen, you know, I think it would be lovely if we could invite Fergie. She's a friend of mine, she's about the same age as Andrew.
Both were good time gals and boys, and the scene was set at Windsor Castle with a lot of booze.
They sat next to each other and they were flirting almost from the, you know, from
Plate of profiterole rolls and said, don't worry, I'll have some too, and then didn't. So I think she gave him a sort of playful slap, and I think that was really the beginning of their relationship.
It was the start of a romance that would spark intense public interest in Fergie's family.
She came from a very well-to-do family. Sarah's mother, Susan, married Ronald Ferguson when she was only 18 years old, and they had two children, Sarah, who's called Fergie, and her sister Jane. And they bought this beautiful house called Lowood, very near Ascot, in that very beautiful area full of rhododendrons and trees and houses hidden behind big gates. And that's where Fergie grew up.
they always were aspirational. I think they had a feeling they were sort of almost minor aristocracy. For Sarah, in the back of her mind, she was always going to try to get a husband who was special and certainly rich.
Even for the well-to-do Fergusons, Fergie's relationship with Andrew was a tantalising prospect.
Ronald Ferguson was absolutely thrilled and delighted. 10 out of 10 for him. She couldn't have done better. Marrying into the royal family has to change things, doesn't it? Because it's that final bit of icing on the cake.
But there are hurdles to clear for a royal bride-to-be, not least a stern examination of the family tree. Thankfully, when it came to the Fergusons, the Windsors didn't have to look too far from their own.
Some people like to say that Sarah Ferguson was middle class, but she wasn't.
No, oh, my God, to be thought of as a commoner, my goodness, no, they were very much upper-class English.
The Ferguson family actually can trace their lineage back to the royal family. So Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew are very, very distantly related through Charles II, but not that that is much of a cause for concern for the royal family. In fact, they probably encourage that.
It wasn't just shared distant relations that tied the Fergusons to the Windsors, but also their social circles.
Ron Ferguson, Fergie's father, had mixed with members of the royal family for many years. He'd been in a very smart cavalry regiment. He'd ridden alongside the Queen on the Mall. He'd played polo with Prince Philip. And of course, he managed the polo lifestyle of the Prince of Wales. So they were a family that the Windsors were familiar with.
Because horses and polo was such a big part of her parents' life, Fergie, in fact, met Andrew when she was around 3 years old. Of course, neither of them would have remembered, on the side of the polo field. So actually, throughout her childhood and adolescence, Sarah had a lot of exposure to the aristocracy and to the royal family. She was very much part of that crowd.
At the age of 13, her parents, Ronald and Susan, had separated.
Sarah was at a pivotal age. I mean, those early teenage years, it can really mess with your head when things at home aren't the way you want them to be and aren't the way you expect them to be.
She had this magical childhood, and then suddenly it all sort of folded. She talks about it herself, how that's when she started to feel very insecure and inadequate, and she blamed herself for the breakup of her parents' marriage.
In 1975, Sarah's mother Susan left the UK to start a new life with a new man in Argentina, leaving Sarah and her older sister Jane to be brought up by their father. As Sarah grew into adulthood, Ron Ferguson's influence on her would be profound.
After Sarah's mother ran off to Argentina, she became quite a daddy's girl. I think she got a lot of strength from having her father solidly behind her, and he was very good with her.
I mean, she approached everything full-throated, full throttle, went for it, in very much the way that Major Ferguson, as he then was, would have done. Ex-soldier, lived life at the charge, if you like. And so there's sort of a resolution that she took, that she was going to find Mr. Right and settle down, and the marriage would be for keeps.
With Ron Ferguson's sense of determination running through her, Fergie's pursuit of happiness had now led her to her dashing prince. As their courtship blossomed, it was soon time for Andrew to take the relationship to the next daunting level.
Sarah was invited to Sandringham for a shooting weekend because the Queen always believed that, that the only way that her children are going to ever get to know anyone is to entertain them in one of the royal homes.
Well, I think for Sarah to meet the Windsors is a hugely pressurising point in her early relationship with Andrew, because here you are, you're the outsider coming in. You know that everybody's gaze is on you.
Her own mother and father had been to Sandringham for shooting weekends, and obviously they had told her what to do. So she was not completely ignorant of how it was going to work, but she was very nervous.
So I think she found herself in that situation feeling, I don't know if they're going to like me, I also want them to absolutely adore me, and all that at once can be a pressure cooker situation for things to go monumentally wrong. And I think in Sarah's case, they kind of did.
When she walked into the double sitting room at Sandringham, I think she tripped over one of the Queen's corgis and she spilt her drink. And then in her fluster, she just thought, who are all these people?
So after that, I wonder whether, from Sarah's point of view, what she wanted to do was redouble her efforts to really please them and be the perfect person in their eyes.
Despite less than royal first impressions, Fergie set about winning over the Windsors by appealing to their interests.
She was someone who really threw herself into the pursuits that the royal family value. For example, she learned to drive four in hand, you know, carriage driving, the thing that Prince Philip at that time absolutely loved, and she was pretty good at it. And Philip thought this was extraordinary.
She had learned to ride at a very young age, and Her Majesty loves horses, and she liked to ride, and the fact that Sarah could accompany her on horseback was another huge plus.
After finding common ground, Fergie's outgoing nature began to charm the Windsors.
I think with the royal family, when they're in their personal time, it is a very outdoorsy kind of life that they lead, hunting, shooting, fishing, and she was up for all of that. So her larger-than-life, boisterous, up-for-anything personality very much endeared her to them.
So, you know, the stars were really aligning very quickly for Andrew and Fergie because she had such a big impression on his family.
Sarah had passed the sternest of royal tests. Her family were up to scratch, and all that remained to unite the Fergusons and the Windsors was for the prince to pop the question.
Andrew went down on one knee and he asked her to marry him. She just burst out laughing.
By February 1986, Sarah Ferguson had been dating Prince Andrew for less than a year. After a whirlwind romance and winning over the royals at Sandringham, Fergie was whisked away to Scotland, where Andy had an important question to ask her.
Fergie and Andrew went to spend the weekend with the Duke of Roxburgh at Flores Castle, well, as you do if you're a prince. And during that time and that romantic setting, he went down on one knee and he asked her to marry him. And I think she was so surprised. I mean, she just burst out laughing.
She thought, was this all some big joke? You know, because she felt she was so un-princess-like. She wasn't this perfect-looking girl, and she just couldn't believe it could quite happen to her.
She said, of course, of course. She was just over the moon.
The Fergusons, when they realised that their daughter was engaged to Prince Andrew, I mean, they were, you know, they were ecstatic. They thought this was the most marvellous thing.
Absolutely thrilled.
On the 17th of March 1986, the announcement that Ron Ferguson had been waiting for finally came. Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew were to be married.
Remember what he said?
Absolutely. But I'm not telling you.
It's the epitome of the social ambitions of Ron Ferguson to have his daughter marrying the Queen's favourite and second son. I mean, it put them front and centre of British public life.
He went from being, you know, a landowner to being a member of the House of Windsor. And he referred to himself as being a member of the royal family. So, you know, the Fergusons had arrived.
Thousands of miles away in Argentina, Fergie's mother Susan was a little more restrained than her former husband in reaction to her daughter's impending nuptials.
How do you feel today?
Very happy, very pleased.
Do you think that something might change in your life from today onwards?
No, I don't see any change.
Because she went to live in South America, I think that Susan, Sarah's mother, didn't feel that the marriage would change things for her. But it's a curious thing. She was very wary.
Although Susan would have been very happy that Sarah was marrying to the royal family, you know, it brings a huge amount of scrutiny.
From the minute the news came out that they were going to marry, Fergie was besieged, as every young royal bride is, by photographers and pressmen all over the place.
You can't put a foot wrong, both internally within the family and externally with the press and with the public.
With the wedding fast approaching and the spotlight firmly on the royal bride-to-be, nothing Fergie did would go unnoticed.
A girlfriend rang me, and I remember I was still in bed and said, "You will not believe I've got the most amazing story."
Sarah and other people at the hen night, including Diana, dressed up as police women and were supposed to set off for Annabelle's nightclub where Andrew was having his stag night.
But before anyone knew it, the real police arrived and sort of bundled these girls into the back of a police van, at which point Diana apparently pipes up, said, "Anyone got any smoky bacon crisps?" And suddenly it dawns on these coppers who are hauling these girls off to sort of West End Central Police Station that they got the Princess of Wales in the back. And, oh my God, it's Sarah Ferguson, the royal bride-to-be. Obviously the girls were let out, nothing happened, but the night was still young. So Fergie and Diana decided to make their way to Annabelle's.
At that time, Annabelle's nightclub in Berkeley Square was the most exclusive.
On the floor, bottles of champagne were being fired in every direction. I mean, it was a bit of a riot.
What the girls then did, as Prince Andrew was coming back from his stag do, as he was about to enter Buckingham Palace, they got the policeman to stop him getting in. And Prince Andrew then started reversing back. I mean, this is one hen do I wish I had been on, let me tell you.
Fergie's A blowout as a commoner did not go unnoticed behind palace walls.
Fergie found it so funny, but sadly a few of the royals, weren't laughing so much, and they did get in quite a bit of trouble about it.
It was a hint that there might be rather vulgar side of Sarah, and vulgarity is something the royal family, the House of Windsor, really don't like because it leads in all sorts of dangerous directions.
Ron Ferguson, of course, would have said, well, she's very much a chip off her father's block. He loved mischief making, and if it helped his daughter relax ahead of the big day, then I think he'd have been very much in favour of it.
On the 23rd of July 1986, the big day arrived. With her father by her side, all eyes were on Fergie as she prepared to become the Duchess of York.
Fergie herself, she was very nervous, but she had her father at her side in the coach going to Westminster Abbey, and he just made her laugh and told her jokes all the way there.
It was huge. Andrew was fourth in line to the throne. He was the favoured son. And so, this had to go really, really well.
The focus was also on the Windsors and how they would accommodate Fergie's fractured family.
The etiquette can be quite tricky when you've got extended families, broken families. I mean, by this stage, both Sarah's mother and father had remarried. She had half-sisters, half-brothers. Were they all going to be invited? Was it okay? Is divorce still a dirty word in the royal family?
The other thing to remember is the fact that Fergie's mother had married an Argentinian. That was obviously a discussion at the time. It wasn't that many years since Britain had been at war with Argentina over the Falkland Islands. So there are all these sort of minor diplomatic niggles in the background which could affect, if you like, sort of the long-term integration of these families going forward.
But things have moved on by this time, 1986, and both her mother's partner, Hector, and Ronald's new wife, also called Susan, were invited. And in fact, actually, her half-brother and half-sister from her father's new marriage, they acted as page boy and bridesmaid. So it was very inclusive.
It was very forward-thinking of the royal family to embrace them at that stage, because it was relatively new at the time in the UK, where you started having these more complicated family structures, and very much in their interest in terms of the royal brand.
With the Ferguson family warmly welcomed, Fergie relished the day that she finally became a royal.
I remember her saying to me, the little girl that used to play tag with Andrew was now marrying her prince. And he was her prince. She truly loved the man, and she couldn't quite believe it.
You couldn't take that smile off her face. It was almost a sort of, yeah, I've done it. Here I am, right up here marrying the Queen's son in full view of everybody. I think there was a sense of triumph about her in many ways, but also a sense that it's unbelievable, isn't it? It's me. It's just me, Fergie.
The day was just as exhilarating for Ron Ferguson as it was for his daughter.
Major Ron had been up half the night, walking up and down the Mall, because everyone was partying there, and he just wanted to drink in the atmosphere.
He was licking his lips at one point. He was very much focus of attention, as well as Sarah, and his whole family were the focus of world attention. And it was like, this is the stamp, this is the seal of approval for the Ferguson.
He'd been part of royal circles for a long time, but to have your daughter marry a prince, become a duchess, with all the grand ceremonial at Westminster Abbey, and to be included in the royal family, become a senior member of the royal family, I mean, it just doesn't get any better.
The union of the Fergusons and the monarchy was now complete. All that was left to seal a perfect day was for the royal couple to make the traditional balcony appearance in front of thousands of well-wishers.
At the end of the wedding, that afternoon, there was just a hint that all might not be well, because they did a very strange thing. They did this odd business of kind of working the crowd up, almost like they were a sort of musical entertainers. The crowd were chanting kiss, 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 and Sarah was sort of conducting and orchestrating this.
Well, I think there's a fine line between sort of exuberance and sort of being over the top. And Fergie strayed too often into the over-the-top realms. She somehow just didn't know when to sort of throttle back.
The senior royals standing alongside There was an uncomfortable feeling about that. Again, the word is, it was slightly vulgar. So, although the wedding itself was good, there was a hint of trouble to come.
The honeymoon period was to be short-lived, as the daggers would soon come out for Fergie.
Charles apparently said, look, the problem with Sarah is you just can't shut her up.
Then her father brought shame on her royal in-laws.
Ronald Fergie offered massage, and the rumour got around that the massage wasn't quite all offered.
And the Fergusons' royal dream quickly turned into a nightmare.
Fergie knew she had to face her mother-in-law, and the Queen was absolutely furious.
Sarah Ferguson, the horsey girl from Hampshire, was now Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. She had brought the Ferguson family name into the royal spotlight, and from the outside, she seemed to be settling well into royal life. But among her royal in-laws, not everyone was a fan.
Anne was probably the only senior royal who, right from the start, was very wary of Sarah. I mean, she called her the outsider. One of the problems for Anne was that she was outranked by Sarah, and officially at least, strictly according to protocol, she should have curtsied to Sarah, and that was never going to happen. What had at first seemed, especially to Charles, to Philip, this bright, positive young thing coming in and sort of adding sparkle, was just starting to sort of leak away. Charles apparently said, look, the problem with Sarah is you just can't shut her up. She could be fun some of the time, but just not all the time, because it was giving them a headache.
The Queen was the one person who, you know, remained steadfastly loyal and absolutely loved being in the company of her daughter-in-law, far more than she liked being with Diana. Fergie loved dogs, Fergie could ride, Fergie could do everything that Diana couldn't do.
Sarah's husband, Prince Andrew, returned to sea, and Fergie had to leave her old life as a Ferguson and navigate the new world of the Windsors by herself.
Whenever you marry, you also marry the family to a certain extent. But when you marry into the royal household, it's a completely different level, because all of a sudden, you're not only marrying into the in-laws, but also all of the advisors, the people working at the palace. It's like a huge corporate structure. There are different factions, different agendas, and you have to be pretty sophisticated in order to maneuver yourself throughout.
I think she felt quite trapped by the grey men at the palace who didn't like her. I mean, the fact that the Queen was her ally wasn't really enough, because the Queen didn't get involved in the minutiae of Fergie's everyday life. So she was under the control of the palace, and they didn't like her. They saw her as too extravagant, too loud, too flamboyant.
In a certain manner. That wasn't Sarah. Sarah was this huge, bubbly personality. People think that living in a palace, wow, how glorious being this princess. She wasn't. It was the reverse. It was very bleak, it was very lonely, and there was no escape from it.
Well, both Fergie and Diana fell foul of the system. So, you know, every 20 minutes you've got an appointment and you have to keep that appointment, and you can't be late, and you've got to be dressed a certain way, you've got to speak a certain way, and you've got to deal with things a certain way. And if you step outside of the system, you're in trouble.
Despite Fergie's problems within the palace, her place in the Windsor family was strengthened when she gave birth to Princess Beatrice in August 1988, the fifth in line to the throne.
So, after 4.5 days, the York family, and now we can call them a family, left the Portland hospital. But who does she look like? Is it her father? Or is it her mother? House of Windsor or House of Ferguson? Well, only you can decide that.
Ferguson blood is now part of the royal lineage. It kind of cements that relationship between the in-laws, in this case the Fergusons, and the royals.
2 years later, another baby, Princess Eugenie, joined the York family and became sixth in line to the throne.
Oyez! 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 Her Royal Highness Duchess of York was safely delivered of a daughter at 7:58 p.m. today. Her Royal Highness and child are well.
had given the Windsors their first royal princesses since Princess Anne's birth. Her most significant champion, the Queen, even came to visit the Duchess in hospital. But despite the monarch's support, Sarah seemed to be losing allies within the royal circle. Even the British press, who had once welcomed her with open arms, began to criticise her behaviour.
Fergie and Andrew first went to America. They were in Los Angeles, and I was there. I was part of the press crew there. I would just remember they were at this very big conference, and Andrew was giving a speech, and then Fergie got up and gave a little speech.
Sarah, and I know against advice, wanted to make a speech, which, the wives of royals wouldn't normally do. It's breaking with protocol. But she insisted.
At last, I have the turn to talk. All these men around here.
Love you.
I'll see you later.
That phrase, it was only a joke, but it had a sort of sexual connotation, which is a complete no-no.
Same sort of flattering headlines that she'd had up until, in the early years of the marriage. It was Ron and her father who stood up for her, and in fact it was one of the things that upset her at the time was that the monarchy, the institution, were not defending her from these, what she considered to be unfair attacks in the press. But her father did.
Although the tide was beginning to turn against the Duchess, it was ironically her father, Major Ferguson, who first brought disgrace into Sarah's new life as a Windsor.
Well, in 1988, there was a huge scandal about Ronald Ferguson being photographed entering a club called the Wigmore Club. Now, the Wigmore Club was a club for men, and it offered massage. And the rumour got around that the massage wasn't quite all they offered.
It was deeply embarrassing for Ron Ferguson because he was enjoying the sort of reflected glory of being associated with the Windsors, and then all of a sudden he had his antics just splashed all over the front cover of all the tabloids, and of course must have deeply embarrassed his daughter.
The fallout from this scandal of the Wigmore Club was enormous, because at the time Ronald ran the Guards Polo Club, and he had a very responsible job, but this scandal really besmirched his name.
He issued a statement to clarify reports in this morning's newspapers. In it, Major Ferguson said, "I have not been sacked and I have not resigned, but I was not re-elected and was not prepared to accept the alternative position."
Prince Philip, who was president of the club, refused to help.
He kept asking to meet Philip and his daughter's father-in-law, and Philip refused because of the associated kind of taint. And it's just, you become basically persona non grata. And unfortunately, look, families, we all fall out, we have tiffs and things like that, but when you have a fall from grace like that within the royal family, it takes a very, very long time to be accepted back in, and in some cases, never.
Fergie becomes guilty by association. This is your father, this is what he's done, and she almost has to mop up after that particular scandal and redouble her efforts once again to get into the royal family's good graces.
Sarah's loyalty to her own family had been tested by her father's scandal. With her new husband, Prince Andrew, often at sea, her loyalty to the Windsors was now also tested.
Fergie was and often when Andrew came back from these long stints, his main preoccupation was either golf or watching television because he was simply too tired to do anything else. And the marriage began to unravel.
With Andrew away in the Navy, Sarah's friendships with other men began to be scrutinised. Particularly when she became close with American businessman Steve Wyatt. Fergie's new friendship was revealed in the newspapers when a cleaner found photos of them on holiday, and the press began to ask questions about the Yorks' marriage.
The stories claim that the Duchess travelled to Morocco with Mr. Wyatt and met for other holidays, parties and private dinners. A cleaner at Mr. Wyatt's former flat is said to have found photographs of the couple together. The prints have been returned to the Duchess
It wasn't an obvious example of definite proof of infidelity, but, you know, it was pretty close.
Typically, the attitude towards extramarital affairs in the upper echelons of society, the aristocracy, the royal families, is that they're tolerated. But I think the sort of cardinal sin is when they are made public and when they are under public scrutiny. It's really the damage that was caused as a consequence of the exposure that was the issue.
When the scandal broke and the Queen was made aware of what was going on, I think she did put her head in the sand a bit. I think, you know, the Queen doesn't like moral confrontation, and I think she always thinks, well, a little bit like her mother, that if you ignore something, it just might go away. But the household are the ones that are responsible, and they felt very, very concerned about this.
The Duchess was becoming tabloid fodder, forcing the Windsors to take action. After a difficult Christmas at Sandringham in 1991, Andrew and his family were called to a Windsor family summit.
The summit early in 1992 was called by the Queen's private secretary, Robert Fellows. All the principal players, as it were, except Sarah, were there, the Queen, Prince Philip, Charles, and so on. And Robert Fellows, one of the Queen's closest advisors, he laid out before them the situation that this broken relationship between Sarah and Andrew was becoming the stuff of the tabloids. Something had to be done.
Separation was a huge step forward, and one which the Queen must have been deeply saddened about, but they clearly needed a break from each other because things were not happy. But I think the Queen was as baffled as the rest of us as to why it had come to this.
Sarah had to decide to either make the marriage work or move on. In March, the Duke and Duchess announced their separation.
The Yorks' apparent separation role and future as a divorced Duchess of York will take the royal family into uncharted waters.
I remember sitting with Fergie, having tea, I think, and she was trying to describe, she said, I just couldn't be in that royal world anymore.
She was on her own again, and who was there to help her and pick up the pieces? Well, her father and the Fergusons. They were really the only people she had who she could turn to.
The Ferguson family's union with the Windsors seemed to be coming to an end, but worse was in store for the Ferguson name. In March 1992, after just 6 years of marriage, Sarah officially separated from Prince Andrew. Any association with the Ferguson family name was swiftly merged by the palace, who now swung into action.
After the separation was announced, all Sarah's formal appointments, all the events that she was booked for, they were all cancelled.
Fergie's royal life stopped.
Once you've stepped across a certain line, you're cast into outer darkness, and that's what happened to Sarah.
The press speculated that Fergie could re-enter the Windsor fold by somehow repairing the marriage. Then rumours began to circulate of a new man in her life, John Bryan.
Fergie was in a very distraught state, so her friend of the moment, who was her financial advisor, supposedly, John Bryan, decided, let's get away from it all. I'll rent a villa in the south of France, and Fergie and I will go there with the children and the nanny, and we'll just have a break. But unfortunately for them, the photographers found them immediately.
Unknown to Fergie and John Bryan, they had been caught by the paparazzi. Sarah later flew to Balmoral to stay with the royal family on their annual summer break.
The morning's newspapers are all laid out on a side table in the breakfast room in Balmoral, and that morning's newspapers were filled with pictures of Sarah Ferguson.
She was caught lying in the sun with this guy, apparently sucking her toes. I mean, he claims, as if it makes any difference, he was kissing her toes. Anyway, unbeknown to Sarah, the newspapers had got photos. Paparazzi had taken these pictures, the newspapers got them.
These are the pictures that the Queen and her son, the Duke of York, will have seen at the breakfast table at Balmoral this morning. An intimate series of photos showing her daughter-in-law and his wife, topless at the poolside in the south of France, kissing a Texan millionaire. The Queen's granddaughters, 5th and 6th in line to the throne, are pictured standing by watching.
self-confident Sarah when she saw these pictures. And apparently Prince Philip came into the breakfast room, picked up one of the papers and just threw it in front of her and walked out.
Fergie went up to see the Queen because she knew she had to face the music and face her mother-in-law, and the Queen was absolutely furious, apparently.
It was the Queen's daughter-in-law. It was so embarrassing.
Fergie had shamed the Ferguson and Windsor names and left Balmoral soon after.
Duchess of York left Balmoral Castle today using a side entrance of the royal estate to drive to Aberdeen Airport. Her two daughters, Princess Eugenie and Princess Beatrice, were with her. No longer the luxury or privilege of an aircraft of the Queen's flight, for the Duchess just an ordinary scheduled flight to Heathrow.
After the toe-sucking incident, the Windsors, they really want nothing to do with her. Famously, Sarah sent flowers to Princess Margaret, who sent them back with a note saying, "You're an absolute disgrace to the family."
The Windsors' union with the Fergusons seemed to have run its course. The Major was subsequently let go as Prince Charles's polo manager, a role he had held for 20 years. The only member of the Fergusons who seemed to remain in the Windsors' good books was Sarah's mother, Susan, over 6,000 miles away in Argentina.
Fergie's mother actually, surprisingly, kept up a good relationship with Prince Charles, and he, in fact, wrote a foreword to a book that she wrote on polo.
Sarah's father also wrote a candid and revealing book called The Galloping Major.
Ron decides to publish his memoirs. I think he had been so stung by what had happened to him. I think he felt it was time he got his side of the story out. So we got from this book his sense of dismay at how he'd been treated by Prince Philip when he'd lost the Guards Polo Club, and then his real sense of absolute bitter disappointment at Prince Charles, who he counted as a close friend, for the way that he was sort of dispatched from his job as his polo manager.
He just thought he'd been thrown to the wolves. And he was extremely hurt. After all, his grandchildren were royal, and so he was linked to them. But, you know, so I think it was a very sad moment for him, you know, after years of loyalty, that he was completely thrown out.
Once you're out in the cold with the Windsors, you don't come back, no.
Fergie was out of the royal family, and divorce proceedings began between her and Prince Andrew. But as the mother of the fifth and sixth in line to the throne, she still had to navigate the world of the Windsors.
Well, basically, after the breakup of the marriage, the family is incandescent with rage with her, because he feels that she's let down the monarchy, which he has spent his entire life supporting, i.e. his wife, the Queen. And in a few years, Fergie had reduced the reputation of the monarchy to shreds in his mind, and he was absolutely not going to put up with it. And he said to the Queen, "She is not coming here. She's out. I don't ever want to see her again."
In the wake of Sarah's divorce from Andrew, the custody of the two Windsor princesses became an issue.
The Queen is being advised that a quick and clean divorce is now needed to protect the monarchy itself, as the marriage of her second son falls so publicly apart. The Queen is reported to be determined that her grandchildren, Princess Eugenie and Princess Beatrice, should remain within the royal family, even if the Duchess decides to live abroad.
It was put forward as a serious suggestion by the House of Windsor, by the royal family, largely because they feel they should be always in control, that they, or rather Andrew, would have custody of the children, and Sarah would be not exactly pushed away, but she would have visiting rights. And I know at the time, Sarah's father was absolutely outraged and spoke to the press of his horror.
He outspokenly defended his daughter when there were suggestions in a newspaper that she may lose custody of her children as part of a divorce settlement.
I think it's absolutely monstrous and quite unbelievable that there should be these suggestions that she should. I think it's hurtful, it's desperately hurtful, I think it's inhuman and cruel.
Sarah and Andrew eventually agreed to co-parent their children. But for the two royal princesses, Windsor family gatherings had to continue.
Your children become the royals' children, and that meant Christmas at Sandringham with Prince Philip, the Queen, and all the other members of the royal family. The Queen loved having her grandchildren around her, but it did present a major dilemma for Fergie, because Fergie was not invited.
Fergie would be offered the house on the Sandringham estate. She would stay at Wood Farm, and the children would go to the big house and be with their father and mother, and they found this a little difficult to understand. I think it was Beatrice that said to her mother once, "Aren't you good enough for them? Mummy, I don't understand." So it was all a little awkward and very sad.
Ron, of course, found this quite monstrous, the way that his daughter was treated. He felt that the Windsors had really been very cold.
In 2000, Major Ron lashes out at Prince Philip for not inviting Sarah to Christmas Day lunch at Sandringham. And I think he shows great empathy for his daughter and great understanding that, you know, she's suffered enough, don't you think? Let her back in, at least for Christmas dinner. And I think that's why he steps up with this enough.
Sarah and Andrew officially divorced in May 1996. Fergie could retain the name Duchess of York, but was stripped of her Royal Highness title. Any support she could take from the Ferguson clan also began to slip away.
In 1998, Sarah loses her mother, who dies in an accident, and in 2003, she loses her father, and her only sister lives in Australia. So we once again find her in that space where she's isolated, lonely, and cut off, and grieving.
The closest family she had left in the UK were her daughters and her ex-husband, Prince Andrew.
Sarah had very publicly cuckolded Andrew, and yet Andrew is very forgiving of her. He continues to be there for her. He helps her financially. Prince Andrew inherits a royal lodge, the Queen Mother's home in Windsor Great Park. He does it up at great expense, and Fergie pretty much moves in with him and continues to live there. It was baffling to the royal family, particularly to Prince Philip, who could not understand why she was still occupying a royal home.
And they were very, very determined to make this one of the happiest divorces you could do. And that's what they did.
As Fergie's turbulent history with the Windsors faded, she was slowly and quietly admitted to the fringes of royal life. But in 2010, she was in debt and made a reckless decision, revealed in an explosive undercover exposé.
It's £500,000 when you can me open doors.
New Prince Andrew?
Yeah.
Is that a deal?
Yeah.
But the businessman was a News of the World reporter and about to produce a $40,000 down payment. When the money arrives, she looks as though she's crying. The conversation then turns to details of the deal.
And then that, then you open up all the channels, whatever you need, whatever you want. And then that's what, then you meet Andrew, and that's fine.
Undercover reporter Mazia Mahmood, dubbed the Fake Sheikh, had posed as a businessman and lured Sarah into a financial sting. At the time, Andrew was the UK's trade envoy. Although there was no suggestion of any wrongdoing by the prince, for Fergie, it looked even worse than the toe-sucking pictures with John Bryan that had effectively expelled her from the royal family.
It was considered to be particularly damaging because it was selling the royal brand for the highest bidder. And when that news story came out, it did damage the brand of the Windsor tea or coffee or a meeting. You just, show them the money.
I don't think the royal family could envisage a worse betrayal than someone selling access to them.
Well, I think probably the senior royals did rue the day that they had ever invited the Ferguson family to join them.
The Fake Sheikh business was one of the low points in Fergie's life.
It looked like Fergie had really gone too far this time and had burnt her bridges with the Windsors for good. Could there ever be a way back into royal life? In the face of scandals, affairs and divorce, there were only two things that joined the Windsor and the Ferguson families together indefinitely. Their names were Beatrice and Eugenie.
The children are the glue between the Fergusons and the House of Windsor, and that glue is unbreakable.
Having grown up in the shadow of their parents, as young women they found themselves torn between the Windsor and Fergie.
Beatrice and Eugenie, by this time, are adults. They're very conscious of their position within the royal family. But they also have this relationship with their mother, who is such a pivotal part of their lives.
I'm here for you, Mom.
Yeah, thanks, Mum. I see myself as a mini mummy. So I kind of have this sort of image that anything you could do, I want to do better. So I want.
I have to tell you, that's easy.
The product of two strong but very different families, they would ultimately have to pave their own way. Their mother, Fergie, was once again out in the cold.
Sarah, why did you use Prince Andrew's name to further financial gain?
Her scandal with the fake sheikh was a step too far for the royals. She needed to get away from the UK and flew to America to film a series called Finding Sarah, where for a reported fee, she publicly examined her behaviour.
I can't get over the stupidity of me, you know. The first person who said it was my father-in-law. For such a smart woman, why does she behave in such an idiotic way?
We see a woman here who has hit rock bottom. We find her at this time in this space trying really hard to make sense of what she's been through and looking at her journey from that little girl who went through her parents' divorce to her own divorce, to her own mishaps, and trying to find redemption in making sense of her own life.
Back in the UK, Andrew was making sure
The second son and the spare, not the heir, has been very exercised with the role and with the standing of his two daughters.
The young women constantly had to walk the tightrope of being a Ferguson with their mother and a Windsor with their wider family.
It's almost a sort of split world. The wild side of them can come out when they're with Sarah, and it certainly does. And then the restrained side, they perform for the royal family. The Queen loved Eugenie and Beatrice.
They've done terribly well, considering the hot water that their grandfather and their mother and father have got themselves into.
This tug-of-war for the princesses reared its head in the most public of settings. In 2011, the royal family came together to celebrate the wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton.
Royal weddings are a chance for us to have a window, a peep into the Windsor world. It tells us who's in and who's out. In 2011, Fergie was plainly still very much out.
Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie were invited along with their father, but Fergie was left firmly out in the cold.
I've always thought it's incredibly harsh, actually, for the girls to be invited to things like the wedding of William and Catherine, you know, prominent role in that, and their mother not to be there.
The wounds were still raw for the royal family, and the split between the Windsors and Sarah Ferguson seemed irreparable.
When she wasn't invited to Kate and William's wedding, it was extremely hurtful for her. As she said to me, you know, she was the last girl to go down that aisle. Sarah felt a real knife in the heart that she couldn't be with her daughters. That was a real nail in the coffin for Sarah.
But even the princess's appeal only went so far with the Windsors. Andrew and brother Charles had reportedly been at odds for years over the role of the princesses in the future of the royal family.
He wanted them to be treated as senior royals, and they're not really. He wanted all the trappings, the money, the protection that goes with that role. And he foresaw their future as being full-time working royals. This is not how Prince Charles sees it. He wants a slimmed-down monarchy, and he didn't want them being part of the royal finances.
Andrew's ambitions were not helped by his daughter's apparent appetite for the high life. In 2015, despite working, Beatrice had been photographed on numerous foreign holidays.
People made it a mission, I suppose, to find her in various parts of the world, and she did take a lot of holidays. And she was pictured, it seemed, every other week partying here or there, skiing in Verbier or maybe in Ibiza at a party.
Beatrice and Eugenie's attitude to holidays and working life was famously parodied in the comedy The Windsors.
Oh, just wanted to check a couple of points on the contract. It says Monday to... Oh, and it says 30 days holiday a year, as though I'm not messing off that.
There's almost that bias to see them from a much more negative lens. Your mum did that, and that's why you're like that. Your dad behaves like that, that's why you do that. And so I think from their point of view, sometimes it can feel incredibly unfair.
The princesses were now going to have to pay their own way. In 2016, it was reported that Prince Charles turned on a written request to the Queen from Prince Andrew. He had asked that the princesses be funded by the sovereign grant.
There is a lot of tension now between Charles and Andrew. Andrew has always assumed that his daughters will be funded by the sovereign grant, that they should be, you know, central to what the royal family does, being real working royals, and now they're not going to be.
For Fergie herself, there was also a glimmer of hope. After Prince William's wedding, the Queen started cautiously inviting Sarah to some events.
She's occasionally invited to Balmoral. She's been to Ascot. I think the Queen is mellowing in her old age. I think very tentatively the Queen is sort of saying, OK, look, we're just going to try this, but if you put a foot wrong, it will all stop again.
Then in 2018, there was a thawing of relations. Prince Andrew and his daughters were invited to the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. But so too was a new key guest.
When Harry and Meghan married, he made it very clear that Fergie should be invited to the formal wedding.
Harry was probably using the invitation as a sort of a reconciliation, an olive branch. He knew that Fergie was not popular with some members of the royal family, but he wanted her there because she was important to him and to his childhood.
It was seen as a sign that maybe she might eventually be forgiven.
The crowd were cheering, and she just couldn't believe that they were all cheering for her. They were shouting, Fergie!
Sarah walks in with great assurance. You'd think, you know, she might have crept in by a side door. Instead, she comes in and almost says, look at me, I'm here, I'm great.
And for once, she felt welcomed. Fergie was back.
Harry was not the only royal getting married that year. Princess Eugenie had her self-found love and was due to marry Jack Brooksbank only months later. It was to be a test of the status of Andrew and Sarah Ferguson in the royal family.
Princess Eugenie's wedding to Jack Brooksbank was really the string that pulled Fergie back onto the periphery of the royal family, because she's mother of the bride. There's no way that she couldn't be invited, and I think it was a uniting of the family.
St George's Chapel in the heart of Windsor Castle was a fitting place for a wedding of a princess. Eugenie's marriage to Jack Brooksbank was to bring Sarah Ferguson face to face with the Windsors, not just as a mere guest, but as mother of a royal bride.
If there's any link, positive link, between the Fergusons and Windsor, it will be the two daughters. So there's almost an inevitability about Sarah being with members of the House of Windsor because of their children.
But while the Queen had been cautiously warming towards Fergie, this didn't extend to her husband.
For many, many years, Philip absolutely refused to have anything to do with Fergie at all. And if she walked into a room, if she happened to walk into a room, which was pretty rare, he'd exit stage left immediately.
It was Sarah Ferguson, who had walked down the aisle 2 years before, who was the most nervous on the big day.
Having not been part of the royal family for so long, she didn't want to put a foot wrong. She only just beat the bride to the door of St George's Chapel, and she got out just waving, and she was like on ebullient form.
In the crowd, there was a welcome reminder of the Fergusons of days gone by. She had spotted her mother's best friend who had come to see her on this momentous occasion.
Suddenly, there she is. Her daughter's getting married in St George's Chapel. The church is full of her friends, and she is in the sort of number one mother of the bride position. So it was immense social rehabilitation.
But as the guests gathered inside the chapel, there was some nervousness around the arrival of a key royal guest.
There was a huge amount of speculation before Eugenie's wedding about whether Philip would finally give way and be in the same building as Fergie. He managed to make it to St George's Chapel and took his place in the ceremony, not far from Fergie. It obviously marks some kind of thawing in the relationship. Perhaps when you get to that very great age that Philip is at, you start seeing things a little differently.
Fergie had a qualified return to the fold as guest of honour in the heart of Windsor Castle, for her daughter would always be a Windsor. But she was carrying with her a physical reminder that she would always be a Ferguson.
Sarah carried her mother's handbag think that was a little sign and a show of love and affection for her mother, who sadly couldn't be there on the day. She obviously, was very sad that her own mother wasn't around as much for her growing up, and she wanted to be there every step of the way for her girl.
But within a year, spectacularly from grace. In 2019, new details of Andrew's long-term friendship with convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein emerged.
The Epstein scandal really seems to have tentacles that reach out and have enveloped Andrew's family because, well, Jeffrey Epstein was a guest at Princess Beatrice's 18th birthday party. You know, he's a family friend. When Fergie was in one of her many money troubles, she turned to him for a loan. So it's very intertwined, really.
He decided to do this interview. He'd only just told the Queen he was going to do it. It was the wrong move.
Do you regret the whole friendship with Epstein?
Now, still not, and the reason being is that the people that I met and the opportunities that I was given to learn, either by him or because of him, were actually very useful.
The thing is, he didn't know what to do, whether to do this interview or not. Beatrice actually advised him to do this, thought it would be best if Andrew spoke openly, as honestly as he could, and from the heart. But it just was a total disaster. Just the worst interview I think anyone has seen.
It was to be a scandal too far for the royal family and for the Queen. 4 days after he was interviewed by Newsnight, Andrew gave up his royal duties.
There's no template here. He can't stop being the Queen's son. He can't stop being a member of the royal family. All he can do is no longer represent or work for that family.
The tables had turned. After years of Andrew standing firm in the face of Fergie's scandals, it was now his ex-wife who was supporting Andrew as he found himself distanced from the Windsors.
There's this huge loyalty, which I think actually comes from Fergie's side of the family. This great loyalty that their father instilled in them. It's a very strong trait in Fergie and the two children.
2020 was to be a new era for the family. For Fergie, none of her family were any longer working royals.
She's carved out her own career. She goes from project to project now. I mean, her latest project is writing, or co-writing, a Mills and Boon romantic thriller.
Sarah has taken to Twitter to reach an audience for her debut novel, promoting it in what looks like a home video.
Follow your heart, but do you dare? Lady Margaret, she loves to ride side saddle. She's strong, she's rebellious, she's courageous.
It's based on a long-distance Ferguson family relative, someone who wouldn't conform to society with red hair. I wonder who she
will attract the ire of the royal family, who she has really worked hard to get back and integrate herself in.
It may not only be in fiction that Sarah Ferguson is thinking about romance. Fergie and Andrew's close relationship has fueled rumours that they could retie the knot.
Will Sarah and Andrew marry again? Will they remarry? Never say never, that's what I say. I'd love it if they did. I think the girls would love it. Whether they will or not is another thing.
But much water has passed under the bridge since the heady days of 1985. With the Windsors, even moments of reconciliation will never mask the fact that for Fergie and Andrew, things will never be the same again.
I think Andrew and Fergie are the most married divorced couple that I know of, but real marriage? No, not a chance in hell. She doesn't want to get back into the straitjacket of royal life. She wouldn't be accepted anyway. There's no place for Fergie.
As Fergie, Prince Andrew and the princesses look to the future, the Ferguson name may not hold the same power as it did.
I think now it's Andrew and Fergie, really, who are the royal outcasts.
I would suspect that the royal family are rather hoping that Andrew and Fergie will sort of quietly fade away without any more embarrassments.
One thing is for certain, in royal circles, Fergie will never be forgotten.
Fergie would never be free of the Windsors. The Windsors were never going to be free of Fergie.
However much some members of the royal family and maybe the establishment and maybe the grey men at the palace may want to permanently distance Fergie from the monarchy, it won't happen because those two royal princesses are the bond between the Fergusons And the royal family.
They really do bring the royal family together. And that is thanks to Sarah, because she's been the most wonderful mother to these girls.
They will remain in the public eye. They will remain of public interest. And so that bond will never be severed.
At Windsor Castle, an unsuspecting Prince Andrew was about to be set up on a date.
Prince Andrew was in the Navy, he was still a bachelor, and I think that the royal family were quite keen for him to settle down. Diana said to the Queen, you know, I think it would be lovely if we could invite Fergie. She's a friend of mine, she's about the same age as Andrew.
Both were good time gals and boys, and the scene was set at Windsor Castle with a lot of booze.
They sat next to each other and they were flirting almost from the, from
plate of profiterole rolls and said, don't worry, I'll have some too, and then didn't. So I think she gave him a sort of playful slap, and I think that was really the beginning of their relationship.
It was the start of a romance that would spark intense public interest in Fergie's family.
She came from a very well-to-do family. Sarah's mother, Susan, married Ronald Ferguson when she was only 18 years old, and they had 2 children, Sarah, who's called Fergie, and her sister Jane. And they bought this beautiful house called Lowood, very near Ascot, in that very beautiful area full of rhododendrons and trees and houses hidden behind big gates. And that's where Fergie grew up.
They always were aspirational. I think they had a feeling they were sort of almost minor aristocracy. For Sarah, in the back of her mind, she was always going to try to get a husband who was special and certainly rich.